When Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's X-Men issue 1 first hit newsstands in the summer of 1963, it had emblazoned on its cover the words, "The Strangest Superheroes of All." And for readers daring enough to peek inside, a whole cast of bizarre mutants awaited. Scott Summers, who as Cyclops emits powerful blasts of energy from his eyes. Warren Worthington III, whose enormous angel wings permit him the power of flight. The ape-like Hank McCoy, who is more beast than man. The mysterious Marvel girl Jean Grey, whose telekinetic powers soon put the boys in their place. And Bobby Drake, nicknamed Iceman for his ability to generate ice, and even ice cream. Which is all very well and good, Stan and Jack, but where does the cream come from? Where does the cream come from? As the series progressed, more weird and wonderful characters were added to the X-Men's ranks. We got a little blue demon-looking dude who can teleport, a white-haired African queen who can manipulate the weather, and a 5'3" alcoholic who can pop huge metal knives out of the backs of his hands. There seemed to be no limit to how strange the X-Men could truly be. But in the late 1990s, Marvel introduced a new X-Man for the era of gross-out comedies and unironically listening to Limp Bizkit. And it was about as awful, or awesome, as that sounds, depending on if you're in your 30s or not. How's your back, by the way? Don't forget to stay hydrated. Anyway, pull up your Jinko jeans, slap some wet look gel in your hair, because hey heroes, I'm Josh from Panels to Pixels, and this is the story of Maggott, the strangest X-Man of all. First appearing in Uncanny X-Men issue 345, cover dated June 1997, Maggott was created by writer Scott Lobdell and artist Joe Madureira. In this first issue, we see Maggott searching for Magneto, who at the time was believed to be Joseph. Although Joseph was later revealed to be a younger clone of Magneto, do you know what? Don't even worry about it. As we're going to find out more and more in this video, late 90s X-Men comics were weird. Maggott's goal in seeking out Magneto was to have the X-Men arch-foe and master of magnetism teach him how to master his unusual powers. And what powers are those? I'm sorry you asked. Eenie and Meenie are two slug-like creatures that serve as Maggot's digestive system by burrowing out of his stomach and eating pretty much anything. Cars, buildings, even people. Once they've finished feeding, they return to Maggot's abdomen and impart the energy from whatever they've consumed back to their host, enhancing Maggot's strength and durability, and also turning his skin blue, sometimes. Look, in the character's early appearances, Maggot's powers were a little all over the place. For example, in his second appearance in Uncanny X-Men issue 347, we find Maggott in the Big Apple, gross, using his so-called psychometric powers to track down Magneto. I think the idea here is that Maggott has a telepathic link with Eenie and Meenie, and they can pick up on the psychic memory of whatever they eat. Although, it's not very clear, to be honest. Like I say, the character was fairly loosely defined in his early appearances, as typified by the fact that in those first few issues, Lobdell clearly intended Maggott to be Australian, saying things like, "G'day then, thanks for diddly," and "No worries, mates." And even, "What is the charge? Eating a meal? A succulent Chinese meal?" Okay, maybe not that last one. However, once Joe Kelly and Steven Seagle pick up the writing duties on X-Men and Uncanny X-Men, respectively, the character gets a fully fleshed out origin, more clearly defined abilities, and an all-new nationality. But we'll get to that in a minute. This video is brought to you by you. Well, those of you who already support the channel on Patreon. So thanks, you. And hey, if you're not one of those people, now is the perfect time to sign up. For as little as $1 per month, you can get access to bonus videos and a Patreon exclusive podcast feed, while helping me keep the lights on here at Panels to Pixels HQ. Anyway, I am painfully British, so I'm allergic to any form of self-promotion. So let's get back to the video. All right, it's time for a new segment that I'm going to call Putting on the Nostalgia Goggles. You know, in all these videos, my opinions are heavily weighted by the time that I grew up. And I always get people in the comments saying, you know, your bias is showing. And yeah, so hopefully by putting on the nostalgia goggles, I can speak from the heart. I can, you know, let the nostalgia flow forth, and it will serve as a visual signifier that that's what's happening. So you don't have to, you know, type out your comments about how my bias is showing. All right, let's get started. The late 90s were a strange time for comics in general, but especially X-Men comics. It's kind of become the forgotten era that nobody talks about. In the canonized history of X-Men, people tend to talk about X-Men #1 and Jim Lee and the formation of Image Comics. Maybe Age of Apocalypse gets a mention, and then it jumps straight to Grant Morrison's New X-Men in the early 2000s. But there was a period there of 5, 6, 7 years where both the X-Men and Uncanny X-Men titles were kind of floundering. And wouldn't you know it, that's exactly when I started reading comics. I first started getting into Marvel around 1997, which is arguably the worst year in the publisher's history, and an absolutely horrendous time to try and get into X-Men. But undeterred by declining quality and the impenetrable continuity, I'd been watching the X-Men cartoon on TV, and I just thought these comics were cool as hell. So of course, I have a lot of affection for this era of X-Men, and by extension, for Maggott. Computer, nostalgia goggles off. Wow, I can't believe that word. Computer, get me a beer.
Don't push it.
So anyway, I've kind of gone all over the place here, but back in New York City, Maggott encountered his first two X-Men in Psylocke and Archangel, and the three have a good old-fashioned superhero showdown. Punches are punched, quips are quipped, slugs get slugged. A bit of wordplay for you there. And it all culminates in them being teleported to Antarctica to take part in the trial of Gambit alongside other members of the X-Men. It's here that Maggott finally comes face to face with Joseph, the man whom he believes to be Magneto, and thanks him for saving his life as a child. And from there, Maggott follows the X-Men back to Salem Center, New York, the home of the X-Mansion, to begin his adventure as the newest member of the team. Back in the real world, and it's time for Scott Lobdell to leave X-Men to focus on writing the Fantastic Four. Hey, everybody say bye, Scott Lobdell. Try not to sexually harass multiple women over the next 20 years. I'm sure he won't. And welcome Joe Kelly and Steven Seagle, who, as I mentioned earlier, would tag team the writing duties across the two main X-books, starting with Uncanny X-Men issue 350 and X-Men issue 70. In Wizard magazine issue 73, dated September 1997, Joe Kelly was interviewed about his plans for the X-Men, and he promised a stronger focus on new characters like Joseph, the doctor-turned-reluctant superhero Cecilia Reyes, the bone-protruding Morlock anti-hero Marrow, and of course, Maggott. Kelly got to work right away on making Maggott a bona fide part of the team, giving him his first big hero moment by having one of his slugs consume a bomb that had been removed from Cyclops' chest just as it was about to blow. At this point, Joe Kelly also decided to make Maggott South African rather than Australian, and peppered his dialogue with Afrikaans slang that Kelly would find online. Like, for example, in X-Men issue 70, the character refers to Juggernaut, and Juggernaut's lawyer, but don't ask, as Vrot Stoepkakkers, which, according to Wikipedia, means something like rotten old dog. Stoepkakker literally translating to porch shitter. So that's a fun new word for you to try out at the dinner table. So Maggott is officially on the team and living in the X-Mansion. And while there, Kelly develops his character a bit more, painting him as a kind of cocky, confident guy who loves flirting with the ladies, but keeps himself to himself at mealtimes due to his bizarre eating habits and the pain it causes when Eenie and Meanie burrow in and out of his stomach. In X-Men issue 76, while hiding in the attic to avoid a medical exam that would reveal his strange powers, Maggott confides in Wolverine, finally revealing his full origin. As a child in rural apartheid-era South Africa, Maggott, real name Japheth, was one of 5 siblings. His family were poor, living in a tiny house an hour's walk from the nearest town, but they were happy. That is until Japheth fell ill. Losing weight and unable to keep food down, doctors believed that the boy had stomach cancer, and not wanting to burden his poor family with expensive medical treatment, Japheth ran away from home aged 12. He took the family car and planned to drive into the hot Kalahari Desert to take his own life, but unbeknownst to him, his younger brother had been napping on the back seat. Japheth was filled with remorse and prayed that his brother Daniel would be saved, but his prayers were answered by Magneto. Either sensing that Japheth was a mutant or just wanting to ease his pain, Magneto used his powers to, quote, magnetically stop his nerves from registering pain. Medical citation needed on that one, I reckon, but when he did, something amazing happened. 2 giant slugs burst forth from the boy's tummy and began to eat, and as they did, it gave Japheth strength. Magneto returned the boys to their family home, only to find it burning. Soldiers had been deployed to squash resistance against the apartheid. Reunited with his parents, Japheth learns that his home has been destroyed. But worst of all, his older brother has been killed. When asked to help, Magneto goes absolutely sicko mode on the troops. Quote, the iron in their blood was forced to a central point. Crushing bone. bursting organs, tearing flesh. Japheth is horrified, telling Magneto that he's no better than the soldiers, and rejecting his cause. I think you have to hand it to Joe Kelly. He really tried to make Maggott a thing, and he took the loosest, vaguest concept for a character laid out by Lobdell and the super 90s design by Joe Madureira and tried to turn it into something three-dimensional. It's got pathos, it's got body horror. Underpinning the ever-allegorical mutant struggle with the backdrop of racial segregation in apartheid South Africa is a genuinely interesting angle, I think. And I can see why Joe Kelly wanted to switch it up from Maggott being a, stereotypical Crocodile Dundee style catchphrase spouting Aussie bloke. Honour to the small percent of my audience in Australia, by the way. Sorry about the accent. At the start of 1998, Joe Kelly told Wizard magazine, "I love writing Maggott and Marrow. They're still so new, and it's like my contribution to this larger thing." You can just tell that the writer was genuinely passionate about these characters. And so it brings me no pleasure at all to tell you that people absolutely hated Maggott. He was criticised for his, quote, absolutely ridiculous powers, his exaggerated character design, his South African patois, and his tenuous links to Magneto and the X-Men. Years later, in 2014, Entertainment Weekly writer Darren Franich ranked every single X-Men ever. 100 entries in total, and wouldn't you know it, Maggott came in last place. To say that the character was unpopular would be an understatement. And behind the scenes, things were about to get a whole lot worse for Joe Kelly and Steven Seagle. 1998 was a pivotal year for Marvel Comics. Just a few years earlier, the publisher had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, becoming a battleground for warring stakeholders hoping to wring the last few drops of profit from the House of Ideas. But by 98, the company was starting to turn things around, shedding the excesses of the 90s and launching new initiatives like the Marvel Knights imprint, under the stewardship of Joe Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti, which ushered in a new, modern style of storytelling that would go on to define Marvel in the 2000s. Over in the mainline books, Heroes Reborn: The Return, which ran across the Avengers, Captain America, Iron Man, Thor, and the Fantastic Four, focused on returning Marvel's core characters to their Silver Age roots. There's a real throwback, nostalgic quality to these comics that was in part damage control towards the end of the extreme 90s, but it also reflected the aging demographics of readers. And I suspect that in the X office, there was a desire to do something similar with Marvel's Merry Mutants, to get the golden goose laying again. Tension had been mounting between editorial and the two X-Men writers. Artist Chris Bachalo, who was a regular artist on Uncanny X-Men during this period, later reflected, "The editorial climate at the time was extremely poor. They kept changing story directions from issue to issue. They'd have the meeting, decide on a direction, and change their minds a few months later." I think it was all very frustrating for Steve and Joe Kelly. By his own admission, Kelly was focused on building up these new characters like Maggott, Marrow, and Cecilia Reyes. He wanted to create character-driven stories that focused on interpersonal relationships. Marvel wanted him to shut up and play the hits. With the cancellation of the Excalibur series, Nightcrawler, Kitty Pryde, and Colossus were moved back to the main X-Men books, and there was a directive to return the team to the status quo of the Chris Claremont years. Speaking to Wizard magazine again about this change of direction, Joe Kelly said, "If somebody told me from day one, we're going to work out the story and hand it to you, and you just plot it and dialogue it, I'd have no problem with that, because it's very upfront. When that evolves over time, it becomes frustrating." Kelly's run on X-Men was cut short at issue 85, ultimately nixing everything the writer had been working towards with Maggott, and both he and Seagle were replaced by Alan Davis, who had previously penciled a few issues of X-Men in the 80s, and had launched Excalibur with Chris Claremont. Davis would write both X-Men and Uncanny X-Men while pulling art duties for the former. The appointment of Alan Davis seems like a concerted effort by Marvel to do the kind of throwback stories that we just talked about. Nightcrawler, Kitty, and Colossus are back in the fold, and the new characters get kicked to the curb. Plans for a Maggott action figure in Toy Biz's sprawling X-Men line were scrapped, and the character was shuffled off to the smaller teen-focused title Generation X for a couple of issues, before disappearing completely and falling into relative obscurity. The final nail in Maggott's coffin, both figuratively and literally, came a few years later in the 2002 Weapon X series, in which he appears as an inmate at the mutant concentration camp Neverland. Maggott is one of many mutants, including his old teammate Cecilia Reyes, who is rounded up by Weapon X agents and marked with either a red or green letter M. Intuiting that this red M meant that he was considered expendable, Maggott asked some children at the camp to take care of one of his slugs, so that, quote, at least a part of him would live on. Maggott is then led away and killed. Later on in the Weapon X series, we see that evil mutant geneticist Mr. Sinister had been working at the camp in disguise, and has acquired Maggott's surviving slug, presumably planning to do something nefarious with it. And that, sadly, was it. A pretty bleak end to a character who was poised to be the hottest new X-Men of the 90s, but was ultimately rejected by readers. So long, Maggott, we hardly knew you. That was until the 2010s, when a funny thing happened. The writers and artists who had grown up reading X-Men in the 90s were now the ones making the comics. And it turned out that they kind of loved Maggott, actually. Beginning with the Necrotia event in 2010, Maggott was resuscitated with magic and the techno-organic virus to become part of Selene's army of deceased mutants. And from there, the character started to pop up more frequently, making cameos at the Hellfire Club or in the background of crowd scenes. Maggott's profile was raised even higher during the Krakoa era, making more appearances than he ever had in the 90s. And by now, Maggott had become something of a cult character for Marvel, with a small but devoted fanbase. This was typified by a small run on the web-only X-Men Unlimited Infinity comic in 2022, in which writer Alex Paknadel and artist Julian Shaw put Maggott at the centre of the story, making him a main character for the first time since 1998. Maggott's status as a black mutant, particularly an African mutant, also makes him appealing for writers like Murewa Ayodele, who made Maggott a supporting character in the popular 2024 Storm solo book. As Ayodele told AIPTcomics.com last year, "I love writing African Marvel characters because I feel a kinship with them as a fellow African. I rushed to the character pool to call dibs on Japheth. The dude has a cool design, an awesome name, and an interesting personality. I couldn't resist the Amapiano call." Now, full disclosure, I haven't read that Storm series, but according to the Marvel Wiki, it looks like Maggott has been killed off again in the time between when I started writing this video and now. Well, f*** me then, I guess. If you've seen my video on the Star Wars character Jackson from the Marvel comics of the 1970s, this should be a familiar story. A character who is hated, rejected by the fandom, falls into obscurity, passes through the trough of no value, and is revived years later as a kind of nostalgic novelty. There is an undeniable allure to these super obscure characters. It's like an in-joke between the most die-hard nerds. If you know, you know, you know? It's why I love to make videos about characters like these, and presumably why you click on them. But more than that, there was always a kernel of an interesting character in Maggott. It was just obfuscated by the super 90s design, the confusing powers, the muddled backstory, and then the fact that the X-Men in general had totally lost their way in the late 90s. Oh, and hey, he did get an action figure after all, in the form of a Marvel Legends figure in 2022, which you've been seeing throughout this video whenever I didn't have anything better to edit in. And thus, Maggott's redemption was complete. You know, I keep coming back to the promise made by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby back in 1963, the strangest superheroes of all. And as that concept for the X-Men was ironed out by later writers, particularly Chris Claremont, they became a band of mutants feared and hated by the world they have sworn to protect. And I can't help but grapple with the irony of Maggott. You know, arguably the strangest superhero of all, feared and hated by both readers and Marvel editorial. And he was rejected for it, in much the same way that humanity rejects the X-Men. In this way, Maggott could represent the ultimate X-Man. And instead, he has just become a footnote in the X-Men's history, an obscurity. Hey, hi, hello. I made this video for you, and that was a really nice thing for me to do when you think about it. You know, I'm not the first person to make a video about Maggott by any means, but I am the first YouTuber to spell his name correctly. Actually, it's spelt with 2 T's. Wow, it does feel good to be a pedant on the internet. Now I know why I get all those comments. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you'll enjoy the video that I'm going to recommend that you watch next. And that's going to be Jackson, the most hated Star Wars character. I want weirdo characters that nobody likes to kind of become my thing. So click that link on screen now, and I'll see you over there.